On this video, we're going to be looking at the concept of demand in economics. So we're going to be looking at things like demand schedules, demand curves, factors that affect demand. We won't be looking at diminishing marginal utility, which is on the spec, because it's not really appropriate for markets, and that's what we're studying at the moment. So in economics, a hidden word under demand is the word effective. So in economics, demand means the same as effective demand, and that requires two things. First of all, it requires people wanting to buy something. So in this particular case, it's matches at the Emirates. So that's a picture of me on the top left. I'm acting there, so I don't normally wear a bow tie. I hate the Arsenal, so I'm not in that market. I don't want to buy tickets to go to the Emirates. Guy just to the right of me, who's clearly at the Emirates, he's a massive Arsenal fan and clearly would like to be there. Similarly down the bottom, if you look carefully, you'll see that those are American Arsenal fans. They have a willingness to buy a ticket to the Emirates. The other thing you need is the ability to buy something. Now, I'm relatively well off, so I can afford to buy Emirates tickets. Similarly, of course, that guy who's in the Emirates can clearly afford to buy Emirates tickets. But those American fans probably aren't going to be able to afford the air flight to get to the UK and then buy Emirates tickets. So they're actually not, for the most part, able to buy something. So they are not demanding it. Most of the time, they might occasionally be able to get across. So for demand to happen, you both need to have the willingness to buy something and the ability to buy it. So of those three people or three groups of people, it's only that Arsenal fan there who is actually demanding Emirates tickets. The rest of us either aren't willing or aren't able to buy it. So we're going to be looking at some of the factors that affect demand in particular markets. This is the data for Ryanair. So the number of passengers demanding Ryanair flights in 1985 was virtually zero. By the time we hit 2020, it was more than 15 million. So what is likely to be the reason for that? Well, Ryanair are known for being a no-frills airline. They are cheap. And so maybe the main factor causing that increase in demand was the price of Ryanair tickets. Price is clearly one of the major factors affecting demand. Now, if we look at the number of passengers globally on planes, you can see that it's risen from around about 323 million back in 2005 all the way up to 607 million by 2019. So there's been quite an increase over time before it dipped. So what might be the cause of that? Well, during most of that time, incomes were rising. And if people are richer, they tend to travel by air more. So there's two other things that we can look at on this graph. You can clearly see there was a big decrease between 2019 and 2021. Obvious reason for that was though people might have still had the willingness to travel by air, they also incidentally had the same amount of money roughly as they had before. What they didn't have was the ability to do so because governments worldwide were stopping air flights. So that's the impact of COVID was to cause that big decline. Now remember I said that the main driver is probably income, and there's support evidence for that. Look at that earlier dip. Now that earlier dip was associated with the global recession caused by the credit crunch and crash of the financial markets. So people were poorer, so demand for air travel actually fell. So for my next market, I'm looking at Apple products. You can see this is the pattern of sales of particular Apple products around about in the 2010. On the left-hand graph, you can see the sales of iPods falling away. Remember, this is data taken quite a few years ago, and these days Apple don't even bother to report iPod sales. So few people buy them. So why has that fallen away? Because there are replacements. Typically, anything you could do on an iPod, you can do on an iPhone. So that's that substitute product is going to be one of the factors affecting the demand for iPods. On both of those graphs, you can see spiky demand for the main Apple products. Now, the reason for that is that almost every year, Apple produce a new version of, say, the iPhone or the iPad or whatever. And so there are some people who follow technology and they are going to want to get the latest Apple product. So again, that might be the factor that caused that spike occurring. If you look at the market for cigarettes, there are loads and loads and loads of reasons why that demand has fallen. It's fallen from round about 1 person in 3 smoking back in 1988 to about 12% or fewer than 1 person in 8 smoking in 2022. Now, one of the drivers for that is the fact that the price of cigarettes has gone up quite substantially during that time, from around about £2 a box up to over £12 today. People are far more aware of the health factors when they consume cigarettes. Now, even when you buy a pack of cigarettes, it actually tells you this product is going to kill you. It's going to harm your unborn baby. It is going to do this to your lungs. It will actually show you pictures. They are forced to show you pictures of what it will do to your lungs. You can only buy those packs of cigarettes in plain packaging, and all of this is because of law, because of changes in the law. And there have been some substantial other changes in the law. It used to be that you could smoke in the upstairs on a bus. You can't smoke anywhere now. You can't smoke in workplaces. You can't smoke in restaurants. Cigarette firms can't advertise on television. Sponsorships, they're not allowed to do very much. And there are, of course, information campaigns run by the government or by various health charities and health pressure groups that actually tell you a lot more about cigarettes than perhaps people knew back in the 1980s. So there are loads of reasons. What's the most important driver? I haven't got a clue. So we've looked at a number of different markets and a number of different products, and from there we've managed to look at a number of those factors that affect demand. So what we're going to do now is summarise them. Well, one obvious one is price. So if the price of a product goes up, as consumers we don't like that, so our demand reduces. Except where it doesn't. There have been occasions in the past, and there will be occasions in the future, where because the price of something is rising, people want that thing, and because they want it, because they can make a bit more money from it, then the price rises still further. I've got an example there going all the way back to the 1600s, when the in thing was to hold tulips, those flowers, and people would spend more than 3 months' salary buying a single tulip. And because lots of people were doing it, the price went up, and other people were thinking, oh blimey, the price of tulips has gone up, let's see if we can get hold of a tulip, until that market collapsed. And there have been various bubbles like that since then. So in our time, there's been the dot-com bubble that burst, when basically if you wanted to buy shares in dot-com companies, the value of those shares was going up quite substantially, so people leapt on the bandwagon, the price went up still further. There was the housing bubble before the last Great Recession, where house prices were rising, so people wanted house prices. People were able to get more than 100% mortgages. Banks weren't doing checks on people's income. The value of houses went up until eventually that bubble burst, and that was one of the things that helped cause the financial crash, which is actually on your spec. It was the biggest financial crash, biggest recession since the 1930s. What caused that 1930s recession? Well, again, it was a bandwagon where people were jumping on stocks and share prices. That's the exception. You do need to know about those as part of your macro course. By and large, we need to know that if price goes up, quantity goes down. Now, when we look at the market for air travel, we said that one of the big drivers was income. Air travel is what we call a normal good, and for most goods, if income goes up, demand rises. Again, there are exceptions. But whereas with price, the exceptions really don't matter that much. You'll notice I've got rid of that nonsense on this slide about bandwagon goods. With incomes, there are a substantial range of goods where if your income goes up, demand goes down. So at the moment, for example, it's unlikely if you're a student that you own your own car. Why? Because you can't afford it. But in a few years' time, you're likely to have your own car. So cars are a normal good. But if you're travelling by car, then that means you're less likely to travel, say, by bus. So for you, bus may well be an inferior good. So with an inferior good, if income goes up, demand goes down. Similarly, in, say, the market for beef, minced beef is likely to be inferior to, say, a nice steak. So steak would be a normal good, mince may well be an inferior good. In the discussion about iPhones and iPods, we said that people were buying fewer iPods because they were buying more iPhones. So substitute products have an impact on demand for our particular product. So if the demand for a substitute goes up, then the demand for our product goes down. The opposite of that is a complementary good. So for example, goods that go together, like fish and chips, curry and rice. So if the demand for a complement goes up, demand for our product goes up. Now, a type of demand that's closely linked to complementary demand is derived demand. So why do lots of people get on planes to Spain? Because they like planes? No, because they want to go on holiday in Spain. So the demand for air travel is derived from the demand for holidays. Similarly, as a teacher, I am employed not because I'm wonderful, but because students want to study economics. So the demand for teachers and workers is derived from the demand for the products that those workers produce. So if the demand for the product wasn't there, then the demand for labour producing that product would also not be there. Very important when you study particularly labour markets on theme 3 of the course. I've highlighted there the big 4 that most questions tend to be focused around. But for almost every product, there are literally thousands of things that we could list there. So for example, if the population of a country goes up, that tends to increase demand for most goods. If the demography of a country changes, so in the UK, for example, we have an ageing population, that is going to increase the demand for things like healthcare and things like Steradent for people to clean their false teeth. If advertising goes up, demand tends to go up. If the weather changes, that's going to increase or decrease the demand, say, for umbrellas. Technology, remember back to my example of iPads, iPhones, then every year Apple released that new product and technology nerds want to leap in and buy that product. Fashion changes, laws might change, so the government might ban things or the government might encourage certain things, so that is likely to influence things. Seasonal demand, things like, say, Christmas goods or Valentine's Day products or Easter eggs, that sort of thing is going to affect demand. Government other actions can change demand for certain products. So pretty much you name it, it is likely to impact on demand for a number of products. But I've highlighted the big 4. Now, economics is a social science. Social because we're dealing with society, and science because we are going to be doing analysis to try to prove stuff. In natural science, like, say, biology, we can prove stuff by experimentation. So for example, if you wanted to prove that a plant was either affected or not affected by sunlight, what we would do is we would have 2 identical plants. One of them we'd put in sunlight, the other one of which we wouldn't, and we would treat them in exactly the same way apart from that fact. So we give them the same amount of nutrients, we give them everything else would be identical. And if one plant grew faster than the other one, then we'd know, we'd be reasonably sure that it was sunlight that was causing that particular growth. Now the trouble is, in economics we can't do that. We can't hold people hostage and change everything apart from one factor. Believe you me, I've tried. So in our economic analysis, what we do is we assume everything else remains constant, and we are only changing the thing, like say price or income or the price of another product that we are interested in. Now there's a Latin phrase for that. We don't use much Latin in economics, and that Latin phrase is ceteris paribus. Paribus means basically things being equal. So ceteris paribus means everything else is held equal. So that lets us analyse just the thing we're interested in. And incidentally, a way of getting evaluation marks would be by saying, well, actually, in the real world, it isn't just, say, price that's changing. In the real world, we want to know what is happening to income or the demand for other products. So we make the basic assumption that everything else stays the same apart from what we are looking at. So we could draw up a demand schedule ceteris paribus. So this demand schedule, you can see on the left hand side, the only thing that is changing is price, and price is falling. And in that center column, you can see that as price falls, the quantity of whiskey demanded goes up, ceteris paribus. So the price of beer hasn't changed. The price of meals, if meals are linked to consuming whiskey, that hasn't changed. Incomes haven't changed. So a demand schedule is a table linking, say, the price of something to the demand for it. It's the quantity demanded at different price levels. So you can see, if say we start at a price of 16, if that price goes up from 16 to 18, then the demand goes down from 120 down to 110. And likewise, if the price goes down from £16 to £14, the quantity demanded tends to go up from 120 to 130. And we can turn those into a curve called a demand curve. Now, one thing you'll note from this curve is it's a straight line, primarily because a straight line is easier to draw than a curve. So all of those points on the demand schedule have been plotted on this demand curve. You will see that the demand curve slopes down. D for down is the easy way of remembering that. You'll notice incidentally I have labelled up the axes. I've labelled the 0. So I've said that it's the price of whiskey on the y-axis, the quantity of whiskey consumed on the x-axis, and I've got an origin. Normally you just need to put the 0 in. Miss those out and you'll lose marks. So you can have something called an extension of demand. So when price falls from £16 to £12, we move along the demand curve from 120 kilolitres of whiskey to 140 kilolitres of whiskey. Notice that terminology. I have not said demand has increased. I have said it has extended. So if you move along a curve, you extend. Similarly, if price goes up, for example, from £16 to £20, then demand will contract. In this particular case, it will contract from 120 kilolitres to 100 kilolitres. So if we move along the curve, the terminology you should use is either extension if we move rightwards, if we move along the x-axis, or a contraction if we move leftwards on the x-axis. Now remember that demand curve is drawn up ceteris paribus. So in other words, price is changing but everything else is held constant. So what happens if one of those other things changes? Well, we get a completely new demand curve depending upon where that particular change takes us. So for example, whiskey is a normal good. So if our incomes rise, we are likely to have a new demand curve where we're selling more than our existing demand curve. If, say, the price of vodka goes up, vodka being a substitute for whiskey, then people are going to buy less vodka, so they are going to be buying more whiskey. If the price of a complement goes down, then we're going to be buying more of the complement and thus more whiskey to go with that complement. If there's more advertising for whiskey, then that means that the demand for whiskey is likely to rise. So we get a new demand schedule that is above the existing demand schedule. So if, for example, at a price of £20, we were buying 100 kilolitres of whiskey, then now we're going to be demanding 140 kilolitres. If that happens, then we get an increase in demand, not an extension, an increase. So you get an increase in demand if the new demand curve is on the right hand side of the existing demand curve. And the easiest way of doing it is just to draw it parallel. So an increase in demand is shown by a new demand curve on the right hand side of the existing demand curve. Now, of course, the opposite could happen. There could be a recession. People are poorer, so they can't afford whiskey. Perhaps they're buying a bit more beer. There could be a change in the price of beer, so that the price of beer goes down, so people buy more beer and they buy less whiskey. So we could get a new demand curve where demand has fallen from our original. So in this particular case, if say the price of whiskey is £20, we were buying 100 kilolitres of whiskey before, now we're only buying 60. Now, probably won't take much for you to understand that that's going to cause a leftward shift of the demand curve, and that is where we get a decrease in demand. No, not a contraction in demand, this is a decrease. So you get an increase or a decrease if the whole demand curve shifts. In other words, if one of those other factors affecting demand changes. You get a contraction or an extension if the price of the product changes. Do not get those two things confused, because occasionally I see students make mistakes by confusing an extension with an increase, and that loses them marks big time. Waffled on for one heck of a long time. Time to stop this video, I think.